we're getting started with the contracts class. Is everyone excited about contracts? Well, you should be because they're fun. All right, so it is the second week, third week, I don't remember which week, but based on how the weeks have been going and the questions I'm getting, we are doing the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. We switched it up. We did the buyer's agreement earlier this month. We did the purchase and sale last week, and then we're going to do the listing agreement today, and we're going to spend some time on some technicalities on the legal side, but then also spend some time with the clarification of days on market, or excuse me, coming soon, when it needs to go in the MLS, and then different situations to handle on that. So I'm going to jump in, share my screen, obviously follow along. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. If you do put them in the chat box and I don't answer promptly, just call me out. This means I haven't seen it yet. So you should be seeing a exclusive right to sell listing agreement on the screen. Is that correct? Awesome. Okay. So T is going to be my eyes because she's the only one with her camera on. So there you go. All right. So a couple things that we want to look at this, and we're gonna look at this mainly, obviously, from the listing agent standpoint, for a couple things. One, create a valid, non-voidable contract as much as we can. It's going to also identify some areas that we may need some more training or just to have more discussion based on what I'm seeing. But pretty much like any other contract that we have, those are mostly fill in the blank. You know, if you have to change anything that's in the contract, you're technically practicing law, which we're not allowed to do. So if you do have any questions of things to add or change, just let me know. First part, obviously, is consideration. Basically tells who's the covenant is between. And it's between the property owners as well as the real estate company, also referred to as broker, even though it says broker. As defined in the sales agreement, broker means myself as the broker in charge or any affiliated licensees with Keller Williams. So you can sign where it says broker. You don't have to send for me to sign the listing agreement. The only time that I would say that would be smarter to have me sign is if you are listing your personal home or the home of a family member. Just to have it more of a full disclosure of what the relationship is there, but it still makes you the agent on there. Couple questions that always come up on this whole sole owner. Couple different ways that we look this information up. Number one is you can obviously go to the tax records. That'll give you the information on there. Number two is you can ask the listing agent if you're going in to say, hey, I'm about, or excuse me, not ask the listing agent, ask the seller themselves, hey, who is it that is on the deed? Another thing that would be probably smart to do is you can do a title search. You can do a quick search for the deed by going to any of the counties. You can just go in and simply say, hey, you know, deed title search for Charleston County. 9 times out of 10, it's fairly easy to look up. Now, just as a side note, couple challenges that can present itself at this if you are doing a title search. If you've got a property, and I'll use Lynn and me as an example, if you've got a property that has change in ownership, types of ownership, sometimes you pull up a lot of information, it can be a little confusing. So at that point, you would want to engage the seller. When you were to search, you know, our property, because we moved it into a trust, that took a lot of documentation. So a lot of things come up on that. And sometimes it's a little confusing as to what the most accurate one is. So you can also just ask the seller directly for the deed. So for the time frame of the actual contract, we can jump back into the document. I think I saw that somebody had jumped on a little bit later. So the document we're going through is the listing agreement. I've put a copy of it in the chat box. All right, so let's go back to the contract here and let's talk specifically about the time period first. So this is for the time period beginning on blank and ending on midnight on blank. First thing, I'm going to work a little backwards. Just a pro tip. I would recommend that maybe you go ahead and switch your business practice to have all of your listings expire in the end of June and the end of December. That just keeps everything even. It's on the end of the month. And then from that, you only have to check your listings for expiration twice a month, or excuse me, twice a year. What you don't want to do is, so if you signed it today, today's November 15th, you count out 6 months from now, you get to whatever month that is, you put it on the 15th, and then all of a sudden that date comes up and you didn't have it marked in your calendar and you have an expired listing. So small technicality to change that to just be the end of June, end of December, so twice a year, and then you can round out. Lynn did ask a question as far as the owner and the broker. The broker that was put in here, yes, would be Keller Williams Realty. That's what you would write in there. It's not necessarily your name, but in Keller Williams Realty. So jumping back to the time period. So for the time period beginning on, All right, so there's a couple of different things that we got to keep in mind here. All of the discernment, or excuse me, the decision making from the timing of going into MLS begins with the beginning of an active listing agreement. Okay, so I'm going to use, for example, today that you're taking a listing that may, if they're not going to go on the market right away, that they want to go on the market December 1st. Okay, so let's say for whatever reason they're out of town, they don't want to do anything over the holidays, whatever it may be, but you meet with them today, but they don't want to list them until the December 1st. There are a handful of different ways that you can do this. The first one is you can just date this December 1st. That means you're not bound to any deadline until December 1st starts. So if you were to take this listing today, sign it, you will have a valid listing agreement starting December 1st. The risk in that is that you're not protected. So if they do have a conversation with anyone that says, hey, you know, I can sell your house for more or for faster or anything like that, that person's really not violating anything. You're not under a listing agreement until technically December 1st. So I'm going to come back to this. I don't want to, actually, no, I'm going to stay with this right now. So what that means is if we jump down to section 13, and this is where it gets confusing, but I just want to make it really should be right here. Section 13 is where we start talking about the different timelines of once you've gone on the market and once you've signed a listing agreement. So there are a couple of things to keep in mind. As it relates to the multiple listing service and public marketing, there are two options that the seller must pick. Okay, option one means that they signed it and it was active today, that the property shall be entered into the multiple listing service of which the broker is a member within the timeframes stipulated by their bylaws, rules, and regulations. This shall constitute an offer of cooperating brokerage to all members of the listing service, and the owner agrees that the broker may compensate an agent representing the buyer from the fee described in paragraph 3. Then you would say at this point, the owner does agree or does not agree that the listing will be placed in electronic marketing means, including but not limited to the internet, MLS data exchange, IDX program, or other online services, this will include all information, including the property address, and will share it with other members of the MLS for marketing and advertising purposes only. The owner further agrees, don't worry, I'm going to go back through this in detail. The owner further agrees to permit other real estate firms who belong to any listing service of which the broker is a member to advertise the listing on the internet in accordance with the listing service rules and regulations. Most importantly, broker and owner agree to abide by the rules and regulations of the multiple listing service on which the property is listed. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through this current scenario that I stated on there. Is let's say we signed it today and you wanted it to go, you dated it today, November 15th, and you selected option one. Option one means that they do want it publicly marketed. They want it to go into the MLS. Now they can have it go in the MLS, but then not go onto other electronic means like Zillow and everything like that. But this is stating that they do want it to go into the MLS. They say that they do want it to go into MLS, whether or not they agree or not agree for it to go into all the MLS, or excuse me, Zillow and everything is irrelevant. A couple things that they needed to do is you've now triggered our rules for our MLS as it relates to public marketing. So if you stated option one and you've dated it today, the rules of our MLS, and this is not in this contract, the rules of our MLS mean that it has to go into the MLS within 7 days. Okay, so the old rule used to say once you have an active listing agreement, it doesn't need to go into the MLS for 2 days. Now it's 7. They've extended it. So if you signed it and dated it November 15th, it has to go in by November 22nd to the MLS. Now, if the person wants till the 1st, like we said, then you basically at that point can date the contract back up to the beginning of December 1st. And then you technically at that point have 7 days from December 1st to go into the MLS. Everybody with me so far on the first 7 days? I'll pause. Any questions on it?
I'm with you on that. But going back to what you said in the beginning, just to clarify, inside those 7 days, they could be snatched by someone else.
No, so great clarification. So let's just use the non-delayed time frame. Let's say we sign the listing agreement today on the 15th. You don't have to put anything about when it goes in the MLS. You just know that within 7 days it has to go into the MLS. They are protected though during that time. During those 7 days, it is an active listing agreement. The only time they're not protected is if you post date this beginning on.
Oh, okay. So if you put November 27th and it's November 15th, and that period of time is eligible to be snatched.
Poached.
But even if you do that, you still have 7 days from November 27th.
Correct. You have basically 7 days from whatever date is right here to go into the MLS.
And you're saying again that the reason you would do December 1 or June 1 is just because it's an even time frame of the year?
No, I would say to start it would be based on the seller. Like right now, if you went on a listing appointment and the seller said, look, yeah, we want to go on the market, but we don't want to go on and during Thanksgiving. So let's, get the house ready. It'll look great for Thanksgiving, get pictures done, and then plan on going to market on December 1.
Okay. So they really could say even February 1 and you wouldn't say wait till June 1. You're just saying, okay.
Yeah, the other one, sorry, the June 1 and December, the end of June and into December was for the expiration of the contract, the second date.
Okay, got it. Sorry.
That's all right. So in that case, Lynn, if they said, hey, we want to go on February 1, I at that point would not do the end of June. I would do the end of December just to make sure I had plenty of time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to this example now of what happens during this 7 days. And again, I'm going to just use the time frame as if we'd signed the contract today, and the effective date is November 15th. So during this time, you have 7 days from today to get it into the MLS. That's what our rules state. Also, once it goes into the MLS, you have another 7 days that you can keep it in what is the new coming soon status. Coming soon status does not syndicate. It does not go anywhere except to local agents who search coming soon. Okay, so it's not syndicated. It doesn't go out there. So you don't have to worry about, if you get it in there and you still need a couple of days for photography and that sort of thing. Obviously, it'd be best to have the photography up there, but once you get it in within that first 7 days, you have an additional 7 days that you can market it without showings. So you can now publicly market it to anyone.
Okay, I actually have noticed that. So when I've done searches as a buyer's agent, and everyone who's on this Zoom, please be patient with me because I'm trying to learn the listing side to help teach. But anyway, I've seen the coming soon. So what that means is, as a buyer's agent, I can go look at something that's coming to the market, but I can't show it yet. That's what that's
Correct. It's just basically like hold for showings.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Madison.
Okay, so I am working with my very first client, and they actually are waiting to sell until their new construction home that they're buying is ready. Okay. And as you know, new construction has been a little chaotic lately, and the timeline has been pushed back. So basically, they're not thinking that their new construction will be ready until January or February. So I'm waiting until closer to that timeline to even build this out and have them sign.
Personally, I would get it done sooner. That's up to you. And you've got to trust your relationship on that, right? In a perfect world, there are two things you could, let me kind of go through a couple of examples of what to do it. So it'll make a little more sense, but okay. I'm always under the kind of standpoint of the quicker you have them sign it, the more loyal they're going to be, right? So even if you sign it and post date it, where you may not be, when you're not post dating it, when you're saying the period beginning, let's just say for your example, Madison, February 1, even if you haven't signed it, there's just where you may not be protected by the document, you probably have a fairly loyal client at that point, if they've already signed something with you. So I would say to do that, but let's talk about kind of what scenario happens. Okay, so let's go back to this example that we put the home on the market, or we signed the listing agreement of November 15th, and it's the effective date. Now, the MLS rules state that you have 7 days to put it into the MLS. Here's the thing, though. You cannot, during that first 7 days until it goes into the MLS, market this to anyone outside of Keller Williams or a buyer or seller that is unrepresented by Keller Williams. So you can't basically do public marketing, right? So in that 7 days, yes, you can help them they can get their house painted, they can do all of these things. But the moment anyone outside of our brokerage hears about it or the public hears about it, then you've triggered clear cooperation, which states it has to go into the MLS within 1 business day. And the MLS rules cannot override that. So just be aware of that if that happens. Now, let's just, again, use the same timeline. Let's say today's November 15th, you put it in there, seller gets done a little early, and then somebody goes and posts on Facebook, hey, my house is coming on the market. You then have to go put it into the MLS within 1 business day, but you still have that second 7-day protection of coming soon, where you don't have to show the property, and nothing changes that 7 days. You have that 7 days regardless.
Example of marketing. If you already know you're not supposed to be marketing, who's going to market it without your, like, how does that happen?
The seller. So here's the best way to, sorry, go ahead.
You need to have that conversation with them. That would be part of the listing conversation, to be like, don't do that, right? That would be the best place.
Correct. And that's why this highlighted part, Lynn, would be a good way to trigger it, to say, okay, and what this means, owner, is you have to abide by the rules and regulations, multiple listing service, et cetera. This is just what it is. It's not, I know it seems a little restrictive, but they've got these rules to help prevent any sort of discrimination or anything, which I know, of course, you wouldn't do, but those are just the rules. If you do market it and we get notice of that, we just have to put it in the MLS within 7 days. As long as within 1 business day. And as long as we put it in within 1 business day, we'll be fine. Now, let's say another option. Let's go back to the December 1 scenario now. Let's say they signed today. They don't want to go on until December 1. Our first option that we said was we can't publicly market it, right? But if we do, then, or if we have someone that's, if we want to have it protected though, during that time frame and not have the 7-day rule from the MLS, you can also do this. You can select option 2 on here, which basically says, share my screen again. Option 2 says that the seller does not consent for the property to be placed in the multiple listing service, which means the seller cannot conduct any public marketing, which includes, but not limited to, signs, social media, any communication, oral, written, electronic, that can be disseminated to the general public. So what could happen is you could say, okay, here's what we're going to do, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. We're actually going to select option 2, which puts us under this general agreement here. We're protected during this period. We can't market it to the public. However, when I market it to my fellow Keller Williams agents, they can send it out ahead of time to any currently represented buyers that they have. It's what's called an exclusive right, or exclusive brokerage listing.
What would be the benefit of that to the seller? Why would that be appealing?
It's not, to be honest with you. It's not a Charleston. I've got to look up this form that goes with it. I apologize for not having this. But the reason would be is it would be a way for them to get more exposure without having, but not public marketing yet. Okay, so for instance, Lynn, if they, like I said, if you had the December 1, or let's say you had February or January 1, it was even further out. At least with this, we could put it on the Facebook page for Keller Williams, and those people could send it out to their currently represented buyers. It just gives a way while they're waiting to get any more exposure. To be clear, our company policy is not to have an exclusive brokerage listing for the life of the listing. It's not at all. That, in my opinion, as your broker, and majority opinion of the people, is that does not benefit your client to do so. Now, before we get into it, Lynn, let me show you the document that has to be filled out for that, because that'll help clarify a little bit. So I'm going to jump back on here. Google Chrome. Got it. Okay. So again, we're back at options 2 here. Now, what it says here, it says the broker and owner agree to complete any paperwork required by the multiple listing service of which the broker is a member to verify that the property will not be publicly marketed. Try that in English. So what happens here, Lynn, is this, and I say this to you because we need to make sure that we let the consumer or the seller know this is not the best in their best interest to have exclusive agency for the duration of their listing. It is in their best interest, though, if they need 2 to 3 weeks or even a month to go on the market before they want to publicly market it, then at least we can get some exposure to build up any excitement or any sort of pre-marketing interest. Now, this form is what you would have to fill out if you went with option 2, which is the exclusive right. And as you can see, in an abundance of caution in covering themselves, and I don't disagree with this, the MLS basically highlights for the first part of the page all the reasons this is a bad idea. And it basically just says, here's what you're agreeing to. And I think this is a good thing. I think the seller does need to know that. And then after that, it goes in to say basically the seller and the broker, along with the listing agent identified on the line before, have entered into a listing agreement with the effective date of November 15th and an ending date of June 31st, whatever you've picked. There's the 30th. How many days are in June? Doesn't matter. The end of June. The seller acknowledges that the broker and listing agent participate in Charleston MLS and that this is per their rules. This is the important part. The seller has instructed the broker and listing agent not to disseminate the seller's property listing via the MLS to other brokers or agents that participate, and should be an office exclusive. And then they have 2 options: until blank, which is the end date, at which point the listing agent will submit the seller's property into the MLS, or for the entirety of the listing agreement. I want to be very clear. Number 2, or second option under number 2, is not an approved way to take a listing with Keller Williams. I shouldn't say that. Without broker approval. There are situations, particularly in high net worth clients, high profile clients, we may have a situation where they don't want it going out to the public. They want it only marketed within the real estate community or within the office. Very rarely happens for us. So in this case, what would happen, guys, is you'd say, okay, we signed it on November 15th. That's what's dated up here. But then this is going to be exclusive until December 1st or January 1st or whatever the date was. At that point, you then have the option to A, go right into the MLS for your 7-day coming soon, or B, it triggers your first 7-day to go out, but you still can't publicly market it. At that point, it's probably not worth it.
Can you share that in the chat, that addendum?
Of course.
Please. Or later. You don't have to stop the class to do that, but I would like that.
No, you guys need it anyway, so I'll put it down there now. It takes like 2 seconds. Aren't
you glad I'm attending the class, darling?
I am, because these are questions. I know, all kidding aside, these are questions that everyone's going to have. So I'm glad to share them here. And I'm glad that you are. I'd like to go on the record. Everyone said that I was glad. All right. So I'm going to jump back off. The rest of this basically is just more disclosures of what we've talked about, what the office exclusive does. When it's publicly marketing, then it has to go in within 1 business day. And just, again, more acknowledgements, and then this is signed by the seller as well as the listing agent and broker. You then must present this to the MLS. Okay, so just want to make sure that you understand that. Maria.
Hey, sorry, I was mute.
Okay.
I just get confused about the designated agency when you're saying that we can talk about it amongst ourselves at KW. And how do you explain that designated agency when it doesn't come about until an actual buyer presents itself, like a buyer that's represented from somebody at Keller Williams?
So what would be an example of a situation? Like you had a buyer or you had a listing?
I have the listing, and
okay.
Like right away, I'm explaining the relationship, that required form. And I would expect that they're agreeing to designated agency right away, because anyone at Keller Williams right now could have a buyer. So I can't really resolve that in my head on how to explain that.
No, well, I would just say, understand that, let's go through that. Actually, let's go through that. Before we do, I want to make sure the options, that's a great point, because you will have to explain that this is what that means during that period. So
I'll say
Does anyone have?
Just as preface it by saying in Massachusetts, the option is to explain to them that we are right now a designated agency when you're signing the listing agreement.
They're not a designated. They're not designated or dual until a transaction actually goes under contract.
Right here, but in Massachusetts, it's a little different. That's why I'm trying to like figure out what the difference is here, what the mindset is here.
Yeah, I would be interested to see how they have a designated agency if they're not under contract. I guess you could say we're designated agent if you represent a listing and a buyer, but if they're not together in a transaction, there would be no possible way to have a dual or designated situation.
The way that we say, well, we explain it is that it's designated right away because anyone walking by my office, and I should be discreet, already has likely a buyer for the property. So right away, you're designating me as the listing agent, and everybody else could potentially be a buyer.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we'll go through that. Before I jump back though into the rest of it, do you guys have any other questions about this? Lynn asked, present it to the MLS. You do have to send it to an email. There is an email at the bottom of that office exclusive form that once you have it signed by everyone, you have to email it into them. All right. Any other questions about section 13 and the dates? All right, I'm going to jump back in then. So let's go back to page 1. And this goes into basically the discussion that Marie and I were just having. So hopefully you see the section 1, consent to dual and designated. Give me a thumbs up on that if you do. Okay. All right. So this is where you go into the discussion. So first of all, you were required to have already had the conversation with the agency disclosure form. So at this point, your seller will initial saying, yes, my listing agent has explained to me the different types of agency relationships offered by Keller Williams, which are basically exclusive, dual, and designated, or disclosed, dual, and designated, I should say. This is where you would go through that conversation, Maria, where you'd say, okay, so if we do an office exclusive, just understand that during that time, the only people that could see the house would be people that are represented by me or anyone within Keller Williams here in Charleston. So if that is the case, if it were by me, that would be a dual agency situation. And you either can give me permission to act, or you can either, say you'll consider that, or that you will not consider it. You'll either not consider it, or you'll consider it at the time you're provided the information with the other party. So if you are not interested in that at this point, we can still have an exclusive office listing. We just need to know that you're not going to be interested in considering a dual agency situation with me as the listing agent or the broker as the listing agent.
Okay.
Again, you're not having to agree to the situation. It's just whether or not you will consider it at the time. Again, until we actually have a contract on the house with the party, which would be party to a transaction, we don't have that actual information yet, and we don't go into that agency. However, this would be that when they give permission to consider it.
Right.
Now, in the second part, this would be other agents with Keller Williams in Charleston. Again, if we did an exclusive agency, just know that if any of those agents brought a buyer and we went under contract, that would be a designated agency situation. And this is where you would give permission to allow that, and we would fill out a separate agreement. Again, you just have to consider it. This is not obligating you to go under contract with any of those buyers.
So if they walk into an open house, or anyone from Keller Williams walks into an open house, or just calls me up as the listing agent wanting to show it, I have to have them sign it to say, okay, now we're in a designated agency situation because a KW representative is bringing somebody here.
Not
right?
To show it, no. It would only have to be agreed upon when they go under contract. So it would be at submission of offer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because there's no agency, there's no relationship between the buyer and seller without a contract. So it's an arm's length until they go under contract.
You mean listing contract or purchase and sale?
Purchase and sale.
Okay. Interesting. So I guess I just don't understand, like, why they're signing it right before they go to closing? Or
No,
right
they
at
would sign it. No, the parties would have to agree prior to going under contract.
Okay.
For
At the
purchase.
latest, I guess, right?
At the latest, I mean, they could. The challenge is there'd be no reason to sign an agreement that they're agreeing to be a designated agency with another party because they wouldn't know who that other party is.
Okay.
There'd only be a chance for it to be designated or dual if that party had said, I'm interested in purchasing the property.
Okay. Yes, my brain will have to think about that.
Yeah. I mean, again, at the end of the day, the only time that a dual or designated agency relationship could happen is if those two specific clients weren't under contract together. So if I'm representing a seller and you're representing a buyer, my listing's in Mount Pleasant, your buyer's looking in Hilton Head, there's never a chance they're going to be designated with each other unless they were to go under contract. So it's only designated when there's actually a transaction going to happen between the two.
Okay, I guess I was looking at it from when you sign a buyer rep agreement with a client and they're looking all over, a lot of them, you know, for in the Mount Pleasant office, they're looking all over Mount Pleasant.
Okay. So same thing applies. If I have the listing agent in Dunes West, you have a buyer that's looking in Dunes West, but hasn't looked at this house and is not interested in this house. They wouldn't get into a designated, that would not be designated until that buyer said, hey,
Gotcha.
I want to purchase the house. At that time, the seller would then have to say, okay, yes. And the buyer would have to say, yes, I'm okay with this being a dual or designated situation. And if
Okay,
they
that
don't,
makes
then
sense.
obviously at that point,
Well,
you
and
would
also
That
something
makes sense.
from a buyer's agent standpoint, like these 4 things are on our buyer agency form as well. And they're always, to me, it almost feels like it's really just a placeholder to be absolutely sure this agent has discussed all the different agencies and that the client has agreed or is adamant not one way or the other. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'll think about it if it crosses our path, or absolutely not. I have a big problem with this. So I feel like it's almost like just a reassurance that the agent is having a discussion versus anyone's making any major decisions at the time. That may be wrong, but that's kind of how I've described it to my buyer. Like, you can be adamant now, or you can say no later, but at least we're discussing it now.
Yeah. I mean, that's the perfect way to discuss it. And Latia, I see your hand up, but it's a perfect way to discuss it because let's just, let's say Maria comes in and says, yeah, as a buyer working with Lynn, I'm totally open to considering dual or designated agency. And then Lynn comes and shows our house that's on the market. Well, clearly as a buyer, Maria's not going to say, yeah, Lynn, I think you can give me fair representation as my buyer's agent when it's your house and you're the listing agent or your husband is. And at that point, she agreed to consider it, but it does not mean she's forced to do it. At that point, we could say, in this situation, it'd be better for you to use a different agent. Maybe we find you another agent in the firm, and then it's designated.
Yeah, like that specific house is where the client might say this is no, but it's not across the board.
Correct. Latia, yes, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just trying to make sense of it and thinking that with them having those 4 options, just like Lynn said, it's running it across it. This is a possibility that I could be representing the other party in the transaction, or a colleague of mine could be representing. And if that person initially said absolutely not, then you know that when that transaction comes through or that offer comes through, you know that that's not really going to work because your client had already said that this is not what I would be interested in.
Yep. And there are very few times where there's any pushback on designated. We have had a few situations where the seller or the buyer would say, I'm not comfortable you representing both the buyer and the seller. It is a little bit different if I had the listing per se, personally, and then Latia brought the buyer. It's dual agency because I'm the broker, but really it's fairly similar to designated. So they may be okay with that. But if if I have the listing as the broker, or excuse me, even as an agent, and then the buyer comes in and, I know that same buyer, I know enough about them where I can't necessarily properly represent both of them. And that's where an issue could come in. All right, so let's jump back in. Unless there's any other questions about that. I love when there's a lot of questions, honestly. Latia and Maria, both of you still have your hands up. So just.
Oh, I didn't know I had my hand up, but I do want
Oh,
to,
no worries.
I just look back at the Massachusetts form just because it, to me, is clear on what designated agency is. And
Yeah,
the way
so
that they're
really
describing
quickly,
it
if you don't mind, I
Sure.
don't mean to cut you off. I would love to not have you read that, only because I don't want to confuse what it is with South Carolina agency. I'm happy to have that conversation offline.
Sure.
I just don't want to confuse anyone on that.
Okay.
Because we have a lot of that too, is because in other areas it is described very differently.
Okay.
So let's jump back in onto the agreement. So now we're in part 2, which are the terms of the contract. And basically the terms are where you're going to put in the price as well as the commission. Now this is a little bit different, because this is actually going to be just the total fee that's going to be due for the commission here. So you're going to have your price that's written in words as well as numbers. And then the owner agrees to pay a total fee of either X dollars or percent that's in here. 9 times out of 10, it will be a percentage that is put into the second part here. If in the event you are going to have a situation where you can, you're going to take, let's say, more commission than you're offering out, just let me know, or let your team leader know, or your rainmaker. Now, if you take 7% and offer out 3 and take 4, that's one thing. But if you're going to reduce your commission below 6 and offer less out to the buyer side, just kind of run that by me first, just so we can make sure we kind of keep the not marketing differently from one another. If it is going to be less than 5% total, also just shoot me an email on that so I can understand the situation, because it'll get flagged in compliance. The reason for that is, again, just to make sure we don't create situations where, Latia marks to a neighborhood saying, hey, I'll list your house for 4%. And Maria goes on a listing presentation and it says, hey, I know that she took it at 4%, or will, why can't you? I don't want to start competing just with dollars as it relates to within Keller Williams. The brokerage fee shall be earned due payable when the agreement to purchase, option, exchange, lease, or traded is signed. However, if the owner shall fail to refuse to sell the described property for the price and terms, or if the owner shall refuse to complete the sale of purchase under any written agreement, buy or sell, which they agreed, the broker's full fee shall be due and payable to the owners. The chances of people mainly exercising that are not super common, but you could. I mean, I say that we actually have one on my desk right now. It's a substantially priced property, and the seller has basically kind of gone behind the listing agent's back and said, I'm going to deal directly with them, even though they had a contract with them. So that you are protected in that. This also does say that you defer any of the commission until the closing date or the extension. So it's not paid until closing, and the closing attorney hereby is allowed to deduct the buyer's broker's fee as well from this to pay to the buyer's side. Just a quick side note, something that this will help with is this is a good opportunity for you to say, we're basically in this together. I don't get paid if you don't get paid, because we defer the closing until, so we're working on a contingency. So it's a good time to kind of jump script to this so you're not boring them too much if you're going line by line, which I'm sure most of you will not do, but at least you're going section by section, you can cover it from there. This next part is what we call the protection period, which basically says if the property is sold within blank days of the expiration or termination of this agreement, which shall be the protection period. Let's just use 30 days as an example. That's what most people do. Within that 30 days, if that property sells to a buyer to whom the property was shown either by the owner broker or another broker or any person or firm during the term of this agreement, the broker fee shall be payable by the owner. The protection period shall be terminated if the owner enters into a listing agreement with another broker during the protection period. So basically what that is saying is Latia takes a listing, it goes on here and it expires, June 30th. Well, she's got within those 30 days, if any of the buyers who looked at the property while it was listed with her purchased during that time frame, then she would be entitled to her commission. Now, it does say this protection period is terminated if the owner enters into a listing agreement with another broker for that period. So that's just something to keep in mind. If they then turn around and list with another brokerage company, then you're no longer protected during that time. Now, if they relist with a Keller Williams agent, that's technically doesn't negate, it technically says that they're still protected because it's not listed with a different broker. 9 times out of 10, I can count on one hand how many times we've actually had that happen, and typically we've worked out something between the listing agent and the buyer's agent. So Lynn, on your question, how does the listing agent know how to track that? It's difficult, to be honest, because you wouldn't know until it closed who they sold to. And the only way you'd know if it were back on the market is if it were relisted, and at that point, if it's being relisted with another agent, it doesn't matter anyway, because it's been the protection period has been terminated. So it's really the times where I've seen it work out is where a buyer's agent's out looking and they see, hey, it's most savvy buyer's agent, if they're looking and they see that something has expired and they're like, hey, I saw this, expired last week. I've got a buyer for it, or, if they haven't relisted, do you want to get back involved in this? Because you're more than likely in the protection period anyway. It's a hard one to track, though. All right, and then let's jump back into here and we'll get down to page 2, start shifting gears a little bit to get through this as closely to an hour as I can. Basically, it's the same. The sale shall be defined as the transfer of legal, equitable title or beneficial interest in the subject property, whether for money or an exchange of the property, and shall include, but be not limited to, any transfer of ownership interest in the corporation, partnership, limited partnership, or other entity. Section 3 is where we talk about the compensation. What out of your compensation is going to be paid to the buyer's agent? At this point, we would say, here's how much we're going to offer to buyer agent, transaction brokerage, or other. Subagency is not an actual agency in South Carolina anymore, so this just needs to be updated. We didn't accept it before, so at this point, just put 0 in there as an abundance of caution. And then you have buyer's agent and transaction broker, both of which, in my opinion, you can do what you want with your business. It is not in the best service of the seller to not have a transaction broker and a buyer's agent offered the same amount in compensation. It is no reduced risk to you. It is no reduced or increased risk to you for a transaction broker. It's not necessarily at any risk to the seller to have it as a transaction broker, and it's not a risk really for you doing more work. Also, keep in mind, if you put a different agency form here, a different amount here, you got a sign call, the buyer comes in and says, hey, I want to put an offer in on this, but you're the transaction broker, so you're going to be dictated how much you get paid by something in here. So just keep in mind, you want to offer the transaction broker the same you would as a buyer's agent. Earnest money, basically, this is a huge disclosure that says earnest money, what will happen is once you go under contract, an escrow agent will be chosen to have earnest money deposited. Really, at the end of the day, the earnest money says, hey, I promise to perform on the contract. If the buyer defaults on the contract, the earnest money could go to you. It does not mean it will go to you. This second very bold and under our all caps paragraph says that under all circumstances, including default, the broker, which also should say escrow agent, will not disperse the earnest money to either party until both parties have executed an agreement or until a court of competent jurisdiction has directed a disbursement. So you just want to kind of explain, this is one of the first of many times you want to say, hey, here's what they'll do from earnest money, but please, I don't want to get you into any sort of situation where you're expecting that if something happens, you just get the money. The money cannot be released. It's state regulated. It has to be either agreed upon or demanded by a court. Okay, so we've got a couple of disclosure stuff that honestly, I'm not going to spend too much time on just in the interest of time, but I want to make sure I cover the gist of each one of them. Section 5 is basically saying that you are giving them they're giving you the right to put for sale signs, under contract signs, sale pending, or similar signs on the property. The broker's duties, these are the duties that you have as the broker to secure a contract of sale for the property. They include the directing efforts broker's organization to bring about the sale, advertising the property, the type of advertising that you deem advisable, the different media, anything like that. Basically, it is your opinion as the professional they've hired on how that's going to be marketed. Understand that the broker makes no representation or guarantee of the sale of the property. This might be one that I've seen right now that a couple people might have skipped because they're very upset their property didn't go under contract. Upon termination, broker shall keep confidential information received during the course of this agreement confidential by written request for instructions from the client. Broker limited liability. The broker basically, at this point, this is the broker saying that the owner, the owner saying that they've provided the owner with the benefit services of bringing about the contract on a property, and they understand the risks and rewards and compensating that and the compensation that come to the broker. Now, this is one that you may get some pushback, because this does say that the owner agrees that he shall pay the broker's attorney's fees, and that the broker shall not be liable to the owner in the amount exceeding what their compensation was by reason of their act of omission, including negligence, misrepresentation, errors in omission, or breach of contract. Basically, what this is saying is if we go to court and we sue each other in this, you can't sue me for more than what I would have gotten paid out of my commission if I did something wrong or negligent. It also says that the owner will indemnify and hold harmless the broker and pay attorney's fees for the broker for breach of contract or any negligent or intentional acts by any parties, inspectors, professionals, service providers, contractors. This, again, we've had a couple sellers push back to say, listen, if this goes to court, I'm not going to be responsible for your attorney's fees, especially if it's something that I didn't do. If they push back on this, let me know. We have had an attorney state that, honestly, if they want this paragraph struck, it's not really going to change the liability that we would have, because it's not a super protective paragraph for us anyway. Rarely happens, but if you have any questions about it, let me know. All right, let me double check and make sure. Okay. Okay, section 8, these are the owner's duties. Again, this is a good way to just kind of walk through the contract and say, hey, here's kind of what our expectations in working together. Make sure you give all the reliable information as far as the ownership and operation of the property. You've given me the deed. Have there been any changes to this or anything I need to know? Anytime you get an inquiry from a neighbor, a phone call, a door knock, whatever it is, just put them in touch with me. Part of my job is to give you the best customer service ever. I don't want you to get bogged down with having to answer questions about your home. You've got a busy life. I want to be there to kind of run defense for you. Once you go under contract, the buyers are going to want to inspect the property. They're probably with their agents as well. Again, normally it'll be pretty reasonable. The contract will state that they are allowed to any reasonable, non-intrusive inspection. I would say that always be as accommodating as possible after you go under contract as it relates to showings or anything like that, because you don't really want to use up any bandwidth of negotiation by being difficult in showing. So if they come out, they want to inspect it more than once, obviously they can't just come knocking on your door, but you do want to have the ability to show the house as much as possible. We don't discriminate. This will be updated. It doesn't really, it basically defaults to the nationally protected classes, the federally protected classes, but we're going to offer the sale to anyone, regardless of their situation. All the discriminated classes, we are obviously not going to discriminate to that. This is one where if they do want you to pay fees for separate expenses, that they will reimburse you upon having those expenses. This typically only happens if you're taking a third-party owned property, like a bank listing or something like that, where they want to put utilities in your name or anything like that. This also can be used if you wanted to, if you offer any services to do any staging or anything ahead of time that they reimburse you for, you can put that in here as well. They're going to allow the closing attorney to pay the broker's compensation. They're going to grant the broker the authority and approval to list and publish all the sales data at the closing. They're going to allow us to take photographs. We're going to come back and revisit that here towards the end. They are required to convey marketable title, which means that the title has to be free of any liens, any judgments, anything there. You know, this may be a good point in the conversation to segue over to any conversations of forbearance. Did you take any sort of forbearance during COVID? If you did, that doesn't necessarily have to be disclosed. However, we do want to make sure that you can pay it off with the proper net amount in here. And if you can't, then we would have to disclose that there's a potential situation there. This is them allowing the attorneys and the settlement agent to furnish the broker, being you, the copy of all the final settlement statements. Not deal directly with any prospective buyers, goes back to what we said earlier. to allow me as your broker to divulge the existence of offers on the property and to furnish the broker with any written instructions that you may have regarding any confidentiality for you or the property. All right, let's wake everybody up really quickly. Questions so far? All right, jumping back in.
One question I have, do you, as a listing agent, is there some sort of earnest money that's across the board recommended? You know, as a buyer's agent, I start as low as possible and let the seller push back. But what I'm never privy to most of the time are the conversations that the seller's having with their agent. So is there some like industry conversation happening or that I should know about?
There's really not, you know, there's an argument, right? I'm seeing it go up. I'm seeing it get closer to that 1% mark, you know, $300,000 house, 30,000. I am seeing them be higher because it's multiple offer situations. Obviously, if you're talking about a due diligence situation, I would want that termination fee to be significant if I'm the seller. But to answer your question specifically, there's not an industry standard. If you want to negotiate, say that again.
I said, okay, great, thanks. That you know, I wanted to know as a buyer's agent. Okay.
Yeah. All right, Maria, did you want to chime in? I thought maybe I heard you ask a question.
No, I was just putting my hand down.
Okay.
Before.
Okay. All right. So jumping back to section 9, this is the property disclosure statement. You know, we did a kind of a separate broker minute on this, and just I'll revise now. And with y'all's permission, I'm going to go over a little over 3 o'clock because I do want to get to the end of this, and we're moving pretty quickly, so it'll be fine. But basically, at the end of the day, there's no option where you're going to take the property and list it where the seller's not required to fill out the property disclosure. A property condition disclosure is required in the state of South Carolina for any transfer of property. There are a few exemptions that the state allows, but none of those will be in situations that you'll be involved in. The only time that I could see where you would be involved if for some reason that someone asked you to step in to facilitate the transaction and contract in a forced sale of a divorce or something like that, where, you know, it was, you know, couple gets divorced and transfer the property goes over to the husband or the wife, and then you acted as an agent in there. Okay, that one could be exempt. The other one would be heirs properties, anything like that. There is an option that has been put into that is part of the law where the exemption says if the buyer and the seller agree for it to not be filled out. The problem is there's never a time when you take a listing where that has happened, because you've only taken the listing. So you should not be saying, hey, just initial off on this exemption that says the buyer and seller have agreed. The seller should not, or the buyer should not agree with that. And if you're a buyer's agent, if you show a property and they have the exemption form on there that states the buyer and seller has agreed, your buyer has every right to push back and say, no, I haven't agreed. And the state law states that you have to fill out the property disclosure. There are case studies, just for, you know, from our risk management standpoint, where when the property disclosure is filled out, it does indemnify the agents in the transaction as well as the seller from more damage because they have filled it out. If you're a buyer's agent and you go in and you put an offer in on a property and you don't advise your buyer of the risk and the pushback on the fact that the property disclosure is not filled out, understand that, you know, we may be open to a little bit of exposure because at that point we've allowed our buyer, so to speak, to move forward without a property disclosure filled out, and they kind of were forced to sign that they agreed to it. We're seeing a lot of that right now. There's a lot of discussion on the board level. Quite frankly, the board still has a document up. Let me see if they still have it. Yeah, this right here. I've been asking for this to be taken down for 3 months now, because this is not a forum that we should be using. It's simply a list of ways that the seller could be exempt, none of which apply to us. So you want to make sure, again, I can't help you fill it out. If you flip the property or, you know, you bought it to do whatever, just because you haven't lived in it doesn't matter. Just because you haven't lived in it in 20 years doesn't matter. You still have to fill out the property disclosure. If you don't know the answers, you simply put no representation on there. Disclosure, the owner is authorizing the broker to disclose information of the property, following up on the property disclosure. Taxes, the owner agrees to comply with provision of South Carolina taxes regarding withholding requirements of any non-residents, any rollback taxes, any prorated taxes. That'll all be handled at closing. If your property is found to be in the Coastal Tidelands and Wetlands Act, an addendum will be attached to the sales agreement that the buyer presents. Section 13, we covered in detail earlier. Section 14, lockbox. This is where the owner does agree or does not agree to put the lockbox on the property, and then any disclosure of risks that they need from that. If you are listing a property with a tenant, you do need to have the tenant sign the lockbox addendum. That is the one that they would sign stating, yes, I know a lockbox is going on the house, and also discloses the information and possible risks. Owner understands that I'm responsible as your agent to present any offers even after you have an offer on the house, or even after our agreement terminates. It does say the broker shall not continue to market the property after an offer has been accepted unless requested in writing by the owner to do so, which most owners want you to do so. Just understand that our MLS rules state that it does have to be marked as active contingent. This section 17 basically says that brokerage commissions are negotiable. We didn't negotiate out. There are no set fees or anything. Paragraph 18 is an important one. This basically just says that you agree to maintain the property, including but not limited to your lawn, shrubbery, grounds until the day of closing, or possession, whichever comes first. The owner also warrants that all heating, air conditioning, electrical, and plumbing system, as well as built-in and appurtenant equipment or appliances, shall be in operative condition on the day of closing or possession, whichever occurs first. So again, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if there's anything in the property that may be negotiated that isn't working properly, we need to know that ahead of time. For instance, if you're going to throw in the washer and dryer or the refrigerator and the ice maker doesn't work, we need to disclose that that appliance does not work, so there's no confusion for the buyer. Agreement to sell basically says when a buyer is found in the property, you shall enter a written sales agreement and follow that agreement. Lead-based paint, if the property was built on or before, or excuse me, built before 1978, they will be required to fill out all the lead-based paint paperwork and disclosures. Section 21 says if you and I, Mr. Seller, were to get into an argument, we would agree to mediate instead of suing each other. Section 22 again covers fair housing. The property is offered without regard to any of the protected classes for sale, which, by the way, for a lot of you that don't know, I know this whole coming soon and clear cooperation thing sounds kind of like overkill. And quite frankly, it is having a terrible unintended consequence of just making this entire thing very confusing. So, but the original intent of the fair house, or excuse me, of the clear cooperation, which states that anytime you market to the public, it has to go into the MLS. The original intent of that was based on a fair housing study done in the Northeast, where basically it was disgusting. I mean, the steering that was being done and things, and the discrimination that was being done. It's very rampant in parts of the country. And so the National Association of Realtors response to that was to say, okay, well then if that's the case, if you're going to show anyone in the public, then you are required by law to show everyone in the public. I get the spirit of that. I 100% do. The challenge is if someone's going to do that without the MLS rules, they're going to do it regardless. I mean, that person's just a garbage person, right? So that's going to happen anyway. So it's probably not preventing what we hoped it to, but the spirit was there. And I just give you that for context because a lot of people just think that NAR is out there just trying to make our jobs harder. And no, they're intent on this. And believe you me, I'm not a fan of clear cooperation. I think it's a disaster, but their intent on it, I get it. There's something that needs to be done. We just got to find another way. All right, sorry, off my soapbox. All right, section 23. This is one of the most updated paragraphs, which says fax machines are going to be allowed. So in case you use a fax machine on any of your negotiations, it's accepted. It is an enforceable contract, and therefore the owner agrees to reimburse or indemnify or pay all broker costs should they default. Any information that's needed by for criminals, sex offenders, or any information outside of that, everyone acknowledges that the listing or buyer brokerages are not responsible for that has to be surveyed on their own or researched on their own. Paragraph 26 basically says that the seller irrevocably conveys any and all seller's audio, photography, and videography rights in perpetuity involving the seller, seller's family, and seller's property to broker for marketing. Now, this is kind of scary when some people read it, but the reason that it is so you can sit down and say, okay, Latia, when we market your property, we're going to have professional photos done, drone photography done. And this is basically stating that that belongs to me and the photographer. And the reason we say irrevocably is because once we put it on the internet, we can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. So I just want to make sure you're clear on that. This is not for any other reason to know that if you do have sensitive information or you do want to change, like the example that I give all the time is, a lot of people will have their children's rooms and they'll have their children's names up on the wall. And they don't want that. And that's fine, but you would want to make sure you change that before photography, or we just didn't take a picture of that, because we can't, even when it sells, by the way, we can remove some pictures, but we can't guarantee that they're removed from all the sites. Section 27 is based on surveillance, which says that the seller agrees to abide by any laws and regulations regarding audio and video surveillance on the property. And the seller agrees that the broker may or may not disclose potential surveillance as broker deems necessary, including on the property and in advertising and marketing. The big thing on that right now is going to be Ring doorbells. Any surveillance that's done in there, you just need to make sure if they do plan on doing that, whether or not they're okay with you disclosing it. It's also said but you also should say that when a buyer signs a buyer agency agreement, they are advised to just understand that any property could be surveilling them. So even if they don't want it disclosed, assume the buyer's already assuming it. And then the rest are all signatures and all that stuff. Questions?
No, that was great. I appreciate it. I'm gonna have to read through and kind of like make sure I understand things, but you did a great job of explaining it. Thank you.
That's good to hear. Well, yeah, for anyone, go through, read it, dissect it.
It's like, I understand so much of this because I do a lot of it's in the buyer agency, right? But the question I do have, this is a challenge I always run into with really flipping suspicious buyers. They think that the seller's disclosure is just for suspicious buyers, not everyone, but they're like, well, someone could do this, blah, blah, blah. Like, what is the protection mode of the property disclosure? What's a good script for me? And what's a good script for a listing agent to be able to make everyone realize how freaking serious this is supposed to be? Or am I the only one who still thinks it's serious?
So just so I clarify, like your concern is that you want to make sure, are you concerned more from the buyer side, how to explain to them, or are you?
Well, I want to know how a listing agent describes that document to a seller, what the proper language is or script, because I always feel like it's, the seller would be held highly accountable if something were incorrect. But a lot of suspicious consumers out there don't think it holds a lot of water.
Yeah, so a couple of different things. I go back, I'll tell you how I recommend explaining it to the seller's agent or to the sellers to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this is basically a yes or no questionnaire. As you go through it, if you know of any problems with anything on that list, you either say yes, or no, you don't know of any problems, or you don't have a representation because you truly don't know. And it's up to you on that. I can't advise you on how to fill it out. However, it is something that a buyer is going to look at prior to coming in the house. So if you do disclose anything on there, or you fail to disclose anything on there that you did know about, you could cause the buyer to have a little bit of heartburn on that. So I would say fill it out to the best of your knowledge, but I also say to the sellers, it is not your responsibility to go out and find problems. These are only problems that you know of to give them a heads up. So, and maybe you can even ask them, are there anything that you can think of now, that sort of thing. I always give the example of a property I sold, and they had a huge kitchen leak, like 6 or 7 years prior to going, almost close to 10 years prior to going on the market, and had just totally not even thought about it when I filled out the property disclosure. And they marked no when it was any water intrusion. And then the buyer had an inspection done, and it was clear that a lot of damage had been done, a lot of repairs had been done, the repairs were all fine. But what happened is the buyer just flipped out and was like, well, you lied. Well, there's no proof that the seller lied. The seller omitted it and didn't do it on purpose. Could you have sued them for, lack of disclosure? Sure. Is it worth it? From a buyer standpoint, I don't think so. And so to kind of approach this from your side as a buyer's agent, I'm going to go to a buyer and say, listen, here's the information we know on the property. Is there anything on here that would be an absolute deal breaker for you if it were incorrect? Example, piping. We get this all the time. I see this, I probably see this 4 or 5 times a month. Seller fills out everything. No. They put piping, they put PVC because they saw a piece of PVC coming out of their hot water heater. And in the inspection, polybutylene comes up. Buyer freaks out, says, I hate polybutylene. I never would have bought the house if I'd known. Well, now you go into this whole argument of whether or not they knew and they intentionally concealed it. So I would always just say to the buyer, listen, this is a snapshot of what the seller thinks is going on with the house. Honestly, Mr. Buyer, it's not worth much more than what's on this piece of paper. So when you get an inspection, just know that some things may come up that didn't come up on here. That doesn't automatically mean the seller's hiding anything from you.
Okay. Okay, so like a buyer really can't take any measures against the seller if they find out later that the seller did hide something, or they have determined the seller hid something. Whether their perception is what I'm focused on. If they decide a seller hid something, can they do anything with it? Lawsuits, anything like that?
Oh, 100%. There's always if the seller truly did hide something,
They'd have to have
they'd have to have proof. And most attorneys that aren't wanting to just rack up billable hours will say, you know what, they may have done this. And the thing is you don't have to buy the house. You can cancel the contract and all of this. We can also argue that you go after them for failure to disclose, damages, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, I don't know that it's going to be worth it for you to rack up attorney's fees to go sue a seller to try to prove that they knew something wrong. Yeah. Especially if this is such an easy conversation to have, though, in like concept only, because right now we're 5 rational people with no emotions involved in a transaction. Typically what happens is the buyers, and it's happening. I mean, what you're saying, Lynn, is happening all the time. The buyers will see something and be like, well, they said no, they're lying. They're liars. What else is wrong with the house? The house is it's falling down too. And they're going to kill me next time I walk in the house. Like, if they just go so far over.
Yeah, I mean, it's like also, it's more for me of, hey, Lynn, thanks, but I once had this experience and the seller was shady and I found out after the fact. Or I have a friend whose seller was shady and they found out after the fact.
Yeah.
I'm trying to give them some sort of reassurance that document does come from the goodness of the heart, so to speak, that the seller's doing the best they can. I'm just trying to figure out if I feel like my scripts might need to relax a little, because it doesn't sound like it's really an enforceable document. And I always thought it was. I don't think it is.
There's actually a paragraph in the purchase and sale. We're going to wrap this up.